Welcome, everyone. We are here with Kevin Shea, who works at Noodle Pros. He is a tutor of a variety of topics, but today he's talking to us about test prep because I know that that is what you guys really care about. So we're going to talk a lot about test prep today, ACT, SAT. But to kick things off, Kevin, why don't you tell me what the students you work with struggle the most? Let's start there. Struggle with the most.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely depends a lot student to student. And I think that's one of the things that sort of like separates how good a tutor becomes is sort of whether or not you're willing to kind of like flow and sort of mold the program to the student themselves. Just because, a lot of places, especially like the bigger places, they start out, they have a curriculum. Every kid is going to learn these steps, and if they do it, they're going to do best. But that doesn't really tend to have the best results for everyone. Not every student sort of does best with the same strategies. So it winds up being an issue of, what's going to be most important for this given student rather than anything in particular. But I feel like a common thread, I guess, between recent students has been like some degree of test anxiety coupled with like a lack of sort of standardized test skills, Like I'm seeing a lot of students who are at, maybe schools that don't, prioritize standardized testing, so they don't really do that very much. And then the kids really don't know how to like handle a multiple choice question, and that adds to the test anxiety. So sometimes you have to tease out like, okay, you're going to do the same thing every time. You're going to eliminate a bunch of answer choices. And that in itself, having something to do, makes so much of the anxiety go away if that's what you focus on, instead of like, oh no, I hate this. I always do so bad at this. It's going to ruin me. So I feel like, in general, just like the basics wind up being sort of a big issue. And some kids already are good at that, and then they need, maybe less of that, more fine tuning. But I feel like almost always I wind up being like, well, you need to do this consistently all the time.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so do you find that there's like a particular piece of advice that you're giving all students?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I feel like, when I online tutor, I do the whiteboard thing. But I feel like, depending on the standardized test, as long as there's a subjective sort of set of answer choices you're getting, like on maybe an English or reading kind of section on the SAT or ACT, I really like sort of this mark. So, I'll go down, say I have A, B, C, D, sort of as answer choices, right? I'll go down the list, and, it's really easy to say, all right, eliminate A. A looks really bad. But then sometimes I'll come across B, and I just like either won't really know what they're trying to say with B or not be sure about it or kind of like it. And I like to write like a little maybe mark next to B, sort of like a squiggly line, which has the benefit of like not having to deal with that yet until I've seen what are happening on C and D. And because like any answer choice can only be right by virtue of like being better than all the other answer choices, it's really effective to stop yourself from eliminating something that might be right, which always puts you in kind of like this doomed zone where you're like, I don't really like C or D because they're both wrong. But then you spend forever trying to pick one over the other, and you're still not going to get it right.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I know that for a lot of students, it's the time of the test that they really struggle with, trying to get everything done in time. So is that like one of your big strategies for helping them kind of speed things up?
Yeah. So in general, I guess my thought process is always like, okay, you're going to find the most like efficient and effective way to go through the test. And usually that will be having a plan for how you do everything that sort of like starts to trigger based on what question you're on. But still sometimes then, some students just still feel like I don't have enough time to handle this. And often I feel like that's not an issue of just like not being ready for the test. It's just sort of like, at least, for students that are like me, but a lot of my students, like a neuroticism thing where it's like, I have to make sure that I perfectly have this question right. But like the example I always give to like sort of reframe how this is happening for kids that just can't finish in time is like, say it's the ACT math section, there's 60 questions on there, and you have 60 minutes to complete it at standard time, right? So if you only spent 1 minute on every question, you would have enough time to answer every question, right? So kids will feel like, I'm just going too slow or I don't have enough time. But usually it's a matter of just you need to bail if you're taking more than a minute on any of these questions, right? Like, because no one question is worth more than any of the other questions, it doesn't make sense to spend 2 minutes on a hard one that you're not quite getting before you look at all the other ones after it that might be easier or like more your kind of question, right?
Yeah.
So I always say, all right, on the first go around, at least, if you're not like actively finishing that question, like you're not doing some work that will immediately solve the question, you want to bail after 1 minute. You can circle the answer choice. And then if you do have time at the end to do whatever you were going to do with the rest of that time, you can always come back around to it. But you can never like undo the like, I just spent 5 minutes on this one question because I was like trying to figure it out. So really, bailing is the heart of my pacing strategy, but, I'll even go through the test sometimes, at least a few questions with a stopwatch for students and sort of say, yeah, the reason you didn't finish this one wasn't that you spent too long on every question. It was that you usually spent 5 minutes on like 16 or something. And then, that question alone sort of kills you for 5 other questions.
Yeah, I remember when I was studying for both tests. I took the ACT and the SAT, but I took the ACT more because I knew that was preferred in kind of the schools I was going to. But I remember someone telling me, like, if you read through the question and you don't understand what you need to do immediately, skip it. You can go back.
Yeah.
Like, don't even, like, if you can start working on it and spend a minute and then you realize I don't know what I'm doing, you definitely bail. I haven't heard it put that way, but that's a great piece of advice. But I can't remember who told me that, but that really helped me. I mean, because it's a race against time.
Yeah. Like I basically always say to my kids, you're almost like really programming yourself in the like test prep part of it. It's almost like picture yourself as a robot. If you could get to decide what you're going to do on the test beforehand, what would you have yourself do? Actually, you can do that if you practice using the same strategies all the time until they're second nature, right? So it usually is a lot of like, okay, if I don't see you doing this every time, you just have to be doing that still. Often like on math, we'll be able to show, you did a little bit more work on the page and then you didn't make any careless errors. We should do that every time. But then, immediately you forget unless you like force yourself to practice doing that over and over again.
Yeah.
So, I think of, the process is like, okay, I look at the paper. That's the question. I figure out what question it is. I respond in the way that I always respond to that question type. And by that point, it's almost like your conscious mind doesn't have to be that involved in the process anymore because all of the work that you did beforehand is just like happening now.
Yeah, absolutely. So sounds like you have a lot of like specific strategies and things that you use with students and teach them. So do you have like a curriculum that you go off of, or how does that work?
Yeah, again, I really don't, like when I was starting out, I sort of got trained and it was like, okay, for math, we're going to definitely do this algebra strategy first. That's always the most important. But now I like, I would never do that kind of like every student is so different. That I basically always start all my programs with like a diagnostic test if they haven't already taken a test, and just get the sense of like, what are you getting wrong, right? And then I sort of react and say like, okay, here's what we really need to focus on now. And the benefit of that is that, like I've had students who, they'll be stuck at the same score on a test maybe, like they've worked with the most important example, I guess like the most archetypal example that comes to mind. Like they've worked with another tutor before. I had a girl who was taking the ACT. She was like killing it on every section but reading, but she was really stuck at reading and couldn't move her score any higher. And I came in and sort of immediately realized that she was only doing 3 of the reading passages on the ACT because like her tutor had told her, okay, you're going to go for accuracy because, you're not finishing all 4 of them. And then, she was only taking 75% of the test. So she was like trying really hard to be perfect at that 75% of the test. But there's only so much extra score you're going to get. But she'd been doing that since she started prepping for it. So I was like, well, let's see what happens if you do the fourth passage, and then she like instantly did way better. And so I met with her like twice and she was done, it's like she got her ACT score.
Oh,
And it's
that's
like, that would never happen if I was like, okay, today we're going to, just cover main idea questions in reading comp. You have to like figure out what's happening with the student first and what's like stopping them from getting the question, and then focus on, okay, here's what's mostly stopping you. Let's do the biggest thing first. And sometimes that alone is like a huge thing.
yeah, absolutely. Having like that outside perspective to see, you've been doing it like this. Maybe let's try it a different way.
And that really is what it all comes down to. The test prep thing is like people have this sense that like, oh, I just might not know this well enough yet. Like if I do a lot more of the questions and maybe on math, like figure out the content, I should be able to get all this. But then you still will go over a math section with students and they'll be like, oh, I know how that works. I should have gotten that. That was just a careless error. And it's like, well, it can't be both ways, right?
Yeah.
Either knowing the content makes you perfect or it doesn't, which it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then you have to work on how you're actually taking it and like what the process of taking it is. And so people always, in school, in like real school, when you're taking a test, you need to know the thing that's on the test and then you do better. But, taking a standardized test isn't like that. It helps to know the content. If you don't know the content, you'll be in a much worse position. But often people just aren't doing as well because of the way they're doing it. And so often that's the thing that you want to work on first, and then you can shore up content after. But in general, right, the content that's on it, that's mostly going to be math or maybe some grammar rules. And there's only going to be so many different questions on any specific one of those. So it's not as high impact as like being good at process elimination and being able to like handle a standardized test question in general, which helps with every question on the test,
Yeah, definitely those strategies and understanding how to beat that particular test is key. Like that's what it's all about. You are beating a test. You are not being tested on your knowledge at all.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, like you said, there is a knowledge component there. But so most of the people watching this are probably either high school students or maybe some college students, but also their parents. And so I know that a big concern that I hear them talk about a lot is easing the stress around test prep and, of course, taking the ACT or the SAT tests themselves. And so do you have any tips for that? I mean, what are your thoughts on like cultivating a positive mindset going into that and reducing that anxiety?
Yeah. So I feel like just one overall thing I always think about with this is, do you know the whole thing where like try not to think about an elephant, that whole thought process?
Yeah.
Where it's like try not to think about an elephant. And then, of course, you're immediately thinking about an elephant because like you can't think the concept like no elephant without elephant being in there, right? So like the worst like anxiety advice you can get is like, oh, don't be anxious, because like now you're thinking about anxiety and you're just going to be more anxious. And so what you have to do instead to not think about an elephant is to like think about a dog. And you can think about a dog very easily. You're not thinking about an elephant. You need something else that's going to occupy your mind to avoid like the negative stuff that you don't want to be in there being in there, right? And so for me, I think it often neatly dovetails because a lot of what I do to prep students is like, okay, what are you thinking about for this section? Overall, you're doing these things, and then for each individual question type, you're doing this thing. Before a test, you want to be thinking about those strategies that you're going to try to implement on that test, right? And so if that's what you're running through in your head in the like 15 minutes before you're allowed to start your section, that's going to be occupying it instead of like, oh my God, I really need to get this score on this or I'm not getting to college, I'm going to be homeless. Like you need another thing. And, that's what I tell my students to be thinking about like in the night before a test or like when they're driving there and then like, when they're sitting there and they can't do that section yet, you want to be like doing the thing that will positively actually help instead of, whatever else would normally go on.
Yeah, it seems like that would be multi-purpose. Not only like, it sounds like you're almost encouraging them to take those strategies and like turn them into mantras, or like affirmation. And so not only is it keeping their mind off the stress and the anxiety, but it's also like ingraining in them what those strategies are. And so it's like, best of both worlds. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. I've definitely said that before where it's like almost a mantra. But yeah, I think it's almost this idea of I can only do so much. There are only some things that I can impact, and I want to focus on those things instead of the things that are outside of my control. And in like regular life, sometimes that can be particularly hard to do because there's so many variables. But on the test, you can only do the questions the way that you're going to do the questions.
Yeah.
So think about that. Like you can really have in your head everything that you're going to do. And then, anything else, there's nothing you can do about that. And you got to accept that kind of.
Yeah, that's great. That really simplifies it.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, do you have any final tips or tricks to share with families on the college-bound journey?
Oh man, I wish I had thought of like an extra like sign-off goodie, but nothing is immediately springing to mind. I would definitely say that if you're taking any sort of subjective test, consider making the maybe mark, right? Because you might not have to like say, right, that you have 4 answer choices. A looks really bad. You get to B and you don't really understand it. You can spend time trying to understand it, or you can just sort of immediately put a squiggly mark there. And if C and D are obviously wrong, then it's B and you don't have to understand it, right? Or if like you get to C and you're like, oh, that's the perfect answer. That's exactly what I was expecting to find. Then you also don't really have to worry about B. You can always come back to make sure afterwards. But, it saves you a lot of sort of time and unnecessary mental work that you can put to better use on another question.
Yeah, I'm glad you didn't have an extra tip. I think that was perfect because I think that's such a good tip. And we got to see the whiteboard again, which is really cool to me.
This is the only way that I can like get any ideas across via Skype.
Yes.
Otherwise,
it makes you look so official. You're like a real tutor because you have a whiteboard and a marker, and I trust you now.
Might have a certain number of multiple choices. Yeah. I think that's a huge thing. I actually got this board, this very one, from like one of my students' parents, like a couple years into tutoring, who was a teacher, and she was like, "What do? You just kind of like," and I had done some Skype tutoring then, but I was like, "Yeah, I kind of hold up paper to my camera." She was like, "Do you want a whiteboard? Like I have one." I was like, "Huh." Because it was so obvious and
so simple,
necessary of an idea, but like I never would have thought about it until.
That's awesome. I love it. Well, thank you, Kevin. We really appreciate you giving your tips and advice and sharing your expertise with our families. I will share a link to your profile because it's super hilarious. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a great profile, so just for fun, you guys should read more about Kevin and what he does over there at Noodle Pros. So thanks again, and we will maybe have you on again in the future to dig into some more specific tips and strategies for the ACT and SAT.
That sounds really good. Thanks a lot, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks.